Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Appraisal Buzzcast. Today, we'll be talking about the future of housing and what we can expect in the coming year. I'm Jim Morrison with the Appraisal Buzz, and today, Joan Trice, our founder and CEO, will be interviewing John Russell, the Strategic Partnership Officer of the American Society of Appraisers. Joan, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, John. How are you today?
Doing great, Joan. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm in Florida, so I'm in the Sunshine State, so I have no complaints for here.
Good for you. 38 and cold here in the DC area, so I'm only a little bit jealous.
Oh, okay. Well, we have a lot to talk about today, but let's begin by, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of background on the American Society of Appraisers and how long you've been around and what you do.
Sure. So ASA, the American Society of Appraisers, we've been around for over 80 years now. We're a pretty old organization. Actually, the result of two organizations merging together in 1951, but we trace our lineage back to the 1930s. So we're a long-lived organization. And I think what some people maybe don't understand about us when we talk in the real property space is we do more than real property issues. We're multidisciplinary. So we have business valuation professionals, personal property appraisers, gem and jewelry appraisers, machinery appraisers, review and management folks. So we really cover the entire waterfront when it comes to valuation and appraisal disciplines and issues. So my portfolio, even though you and I talk a lot about real property, I'll pivot on a dime. I'll go have a tax conversation dealing with a business valuation issue, or I'll go talk with IRS on a personal property issue. I've always enjoyed it because of that. I feel like I've got a very diverse base underneath me of issues that I get to work on. It keeps me on my toes, and then you learn things along the way that you can carry over into other parts of the job. So I'm in my 11th year now with ASA. Time flies when you're having fun, but it's been a lot of fun, and I think we've accomplished a lot of good things, and hopefully a lot of good things yet to come.
Excellent. So let's talk about that kind of new topic that seems to have hit the blogosphere a lot lately, and that's the one about racial bias in appraising. So how have you been involved in this topic, and what kind of conversations are you having at ASA?
That's a great question. Let's lead off the top with the heavy hitter here.
Well, the hard
this
part,
is not
right?
This is not really a new conversation. We go back to 2018, the oversight hearing, the end of the year 18. I think you participated in that maybe. It came up then. Dr. Andre Perry from the Brookings Institute discussed a study that his organization had done looking at disparities in the value of homes in majority white and majority non-white neighborhoods. And that really was the first kind of catalyst that got the conversation going. And it's carried forward. We've seen more academic research. Obviously, what happened this past spring with George Floyd and all the racial justice movements that sprung out of that, this has become a very top of mind conversation. Organizations like ASA, we were already working on diversity and inclusion issues. A year and a half ago, we started up a diversity and inclusion committee. It was driven by one of our board members, so it was something we were already doing. This just kind of accelerated the urgency of the work, I think. People are really using this moment as an opportunity to self-assess what we can do better to foster diversity in the profession. I think that's an enormous challenge that we have to take head on and accept. And also whether and to what extent the work that's being done in real property appraising, specifically around mortgage financing, is having a disparate impact on minority communities. And I think what makes it challenging is, appraisers understand they have the requirement to be objective, to be impartial, to be unbiased. They take that very seriously. They have the language in Certification 17 and all the fair housing overlays that tell them explicitly what they cannot do when it comes to someone's race, gender, classification, and considering that when establishing a value. So when we have this conversation, we're saying, yeah, well, there still may be a problem here. People can have a tendency to bristle, and I completely understand it, because most people would tell you, I'm not racist, I'm being objective, I'm looking at the data in front of me, and this is the conclusion that I reach. And while all of that may be true, there are other things that can be going on as well that are simultaneously true. The two that I've really landed on conversationally with people is, one, do we need to think about how sales comparison approach may be inadvertently carrying forward prior bad acts, such as redlining, into the value of a property that's in a majority non-white neighborhood? And then there's also the topic of unconscious bias, which is a very I want to say it's not a difficult issue, but it is very nuanced. And that's a hard conversation to have. And every time I bring it up, you have some people who kind of lean in and they are willing to listen about how that may be impacting their performance without them knowing it. And then you have other people who kind of, they bristle and they're not quite sure how to respond to the topic of unconscious bias. So those are the two that we've really had the conversation around. There may be other factors as well. I think the important thing is, one, we have to figure out if there's something going on, because we now have a little bit more academic research in the topic that can inform our opinion. And if there's a problem, we need to be willing to tackle it. The last thing we need is to step back from the table and say, no, there's not a problem, and kind of wash our hands of it and walk away. I think what we've learned historically, go back to the 1980s with the savings and loan crisis, go back to 2009, 2010 with HVCC. If we're not positively engaged in the conversation, other people are going to have it for us. And I don't think that's a good posture to take as a professional.
I agree with you. And in some conversations I've had with appraisers, specifically the Jacksonville case that was written about in the New York Times, they just dismiss it at hand. That didn't happen.
I can tell you definitively, based on conversations I've had, it did. I know that firsthand. Maybe it's breaking news to your audience, but I've had the opportunity to get a little more learned on that particular issue. And based on the conversations I've had, there's no reason to dismiss the concerns being raised there. And look, maybe that's the most obscene example you can pick on, where there are clearly overt things taking place that would indicate to you that something other than the underlying data informed an opinion. But even where that's not happening, and this is where it becomes difficult. One is, as a business model, the GSEs and the forms that we use are overwhelmingly weighted to sales comparison, right? I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the forms.
I don't like that.
Yeah,
at all. And I've been pushing for years that doing a single approach to value is exceedingly dangerous. Just even setting the racial issue aside, it's just one leg of a three-legged stool.
Exactly. And so when you have designed your forms and you've designed your data sets almost entirely around one approach to value, when we know you're supposed to consider all three with equal robustness and equal validity, it sends the wrong message from the get-go. But then if we're in these neighborhoods where we know redlining took place, for example, you might not think you're going to carry forward those prior bad acts that others did generations ago, but they're essentially codified in when you over-rely on sales comparison. It's kind of hard to escape it. And there's nothing you're going to do that's going to take you from a devalued environment to being at parity overnight, okay? And I don't think that's a realistic expectation for anybody. But to the extent that we can at least examine the way that the work's being done today and the weight being given, I always kind of equate it to being in a car. We're looking out the rear view mirror a whole bunch. We're not really sitting in the car, which is kind of how I think about cost approach. Well, I'm in the car. What did it take to make this car? And we're not really looking out the front windshield. I think of income approach as being forward looking. What would I get if I rented this car out, right? So we need to figure out how to rebalance the way all three approaches are being considered, and whether that might help overcome if there's an issue. And again, I feel like I'm couching on it. Let's make sure we understand whether or not there's an issue. And I think as there's more academic rigor put around the question, we'll get a better answer. But if there's a problem, one of the things to do is we'll look at the tools you're using and look at the questions being asked by the lenders. And is there something different we can do with all of that to better answer the question in a way that overcomes some of this historical stuff that carries forward from the redlining generation. I think it's a conversation we can have, and frankly, of the two conversations, and we'll talk about unconscious bias in a minute, it's probably the easier conversation for appraisers to have. I gave a talk about 2 years ago talking about the three sides of the rhetorical triangle: logos, ethos, pathos. Appraisers love facts. They love logos. That's your comfort zone. I'm going to loop you in there too, Joan. Ethos, I think there's a strong ethical component. But the pathos part, when we start talking about this more kind of emotional, squishy, touchy-feely stuff and how it impacts people, that's where the discomfort comes in. So trying to get people more comfortable with that uncomfortable space, because when you're talking unconscious bias, that's a really, you're in the pathos, you're in the feely stuff, and getting people to understand that there's ways to talk about it and engage with it. It's not about blaming you, it's not about shaming you, it's not about saying you're doing something wrong because you're not consciously choosing to. But there are things that you need to be aware of and things you have to learn to overcome that are just hardwired into you.
I couldn't agree with you more. I can see how, set the blatant racial bias aside, if I can see if an appraiser was given an assignment that's in a predominantly Black neighborhood and they can't find comps, that they might unconsciously select another Black neighborhood somewhere else in town to select their comps without even thinking, and not intentionally overtly being racist. It's just they see that as a similar neighborhood.
And even think about it this way. I use this example because it's where I live in the DC area, but we're home to PG County, one of the largest majority Black, if not the largest majority Black county in the country.
Right.
You have appraisers coming in from Montgomery County, from Prince William County, from Anne Arundel County, from West Virginia. People travel a far distance to work in the DMV, as we call it. If you're coming from, let's pick on like Howard County. If you're coming from Howard County into PG County, even before you've set foot at the subject property, based on the experiences you've lived and the impressions that are ingrained in you, you might have a different presupposition about that property, about that neighborhood, about that community, because it's majority Black and you've lived a different experience. And that's really what unconscious bias speaks to, is the longer you go through life, you have all these different life experiences that have formed who you are, but also they've created these little shortcuts, these little assumptions that we all make along the way in terms of how we perceive the world and how we interact with it. Because if you had to take on every single question freshly every single time, your little brain just couldn't handle it. So it's
Wait a minute, whose brain are you calling little?
But it's the way that we overcome the constant challenges of all the inputs from the world around us. And unfortunately, this can have negative impacts. Not just, let's set aside race. When you've built assumptions into how you function every single day, do you think you're going to make the best possible decision because you're working from a plate of assumptions that are just hardwired into you? Probably not. They're going to skew you in one direction or the other. So even before we take it to a topic like race, where its effects can be particularly pernicious, it's going to influence how you live your life every single day. Whether or not you want it to, it's there. Now, it has impacts in a racial context that are much more profound than just picking your order at the McDonald's drive-thru. Okay, if you order the same thing at McDonald's every day, you're already biased toward it because you think that you like it, even though there may be something on the menu that you'd like more, and that would be cheaper and that would be healthier for you. You steer into the familiar. That's an assumption you've made. Now take that same wiring that keeps you from making a better decision in the McDonald's drive-thru and try to think about how that would impact you when you're in this subject property. You're in a majority Black neighborhood. It is not the environment you grew up in, not the environment you grew up around. You're not typically in these communities. And now you're trying to answer the questions that a lender has given you about value. And you're using tools that are only going to get you so far. Again, now overlay, and you're over relying on sales comp. Okay, this is where rubber meets road with this conversation. And again, no one's going to tell you you're racist. It's not about overt acts. It's not about the stuff that in Cert 17 we say, hey, you cannot do this, because I truly believe the majority of appraisers don't. What this is about is getting you to understand there are things taking place inside your mind without you consciously thinking about them that will influence how you go about doing your work on a daily basis. And when we're talking about where people live, it's everything from healthcare to schools to food to transportation, the ability to build multi-generational wealth. As we've seen, there's been studies around the impact on Black communities relative to white communities and the ability to build wealth. Everything's tied into that home. So if you come into that assignment with all of these things going on in your mind that you're not aware of and you don't have the tools to deal with, you could wind up making decisions and assumptions that feed into your ultimate opinion that are going to negatively impact somebody else without you meaning to. Right. And so organizations like ASA, we're currently working with AI, with MBREA, with farm managers, rural appraisers. We're going to put on unconscious bias training in January to at least get people to start having the conversation to understand what it is and what it isn't, so that they can be better equipped to have these conversations. Because I understand as a profession, it's not comfortable, right, but we want to make you better. And if there's things going on that you don't have the tools to manage today, we want to get you those tools. And I think that's where the conversation starts in January around unconscious bias, and then carrying that conversation forward in a productive way and getting people to really engage.
Thank you for that. Wow. You baked a lot into that answer. Let me break just for a minute and so that Jim can share a commercial message.
Thanks, Joan. As the provider of innovative appraisal solutions for more than 40 years, ACI is a trusted industry leader. Join the thousands of appraisers and many of the largest appraisal companies that use ACI software in the US and Canada to optimize their business. The ACI One individual plan is available today for $649. It includes forms and rules, sketch software, unlimited location and flood maps, public record data, ACI Open House, and more. For more information, visit aciweb.com.
Thank you, Jim.
They need a tagline there. ACI, always creating innovation. There you go. Free marketing for ACI.
Oh, thanks, John. We like you're taking over our ads for us.
Well,
Maybe I'll have you
try to
read
get bang for buck to the sponsors here.
Yeah, yes.
Trying to be a good guest so I get to come back.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the storm about to happen in January. This is not a global warming event. This is, I started to say, a man-made event of sorts. But, as we learned in the last crisis, we do love kicking the can down the road when we have that, ooh, whoops, what do we do now moment. And so tell our audience what's going to happen in January.
Yeah, so politically, we are in a very delicate situation. A couple of things are all kind of coming together at the same time. And this is where I kind of put my government relations hat back on, right? So December 11th, we need a spending bill for the government, whether that's a continuing resolution or a full appropriations bill. It's likely going to be the former. Otherwise, the federal government shuts down. And this impacts me personally because my wife works for the federal government. So I can speak to kind of how uncomfortable that is as a federal employee when you're told, hey, you don't get to go to work today. They can't even access email. They can't touch their equipment, any of that stuff. Just the lights go off kind of instantaneously. And they're already preparing behind the scenes for that, by the way, because that's what they have to do.
Right.
So you've got that. So you have the spending issue. That's one. The other is a lot of the relief from the CARES Act and the other related bills are going to expire December 31. And baked in there, we have foreclosure moratoria, eviction moratoria for renters, student loan forbearance, even though that's been carried forward into January. All of these things that are going to run out, not to mention, expanded unemployment benefits, things like that, all runs out at the end of the month. So if nothing happens, I don't anticipate lenders and I don't anticipate landlords waiting around real long to start availing themselves of the legal recourse available to them. They've already taken it on the chin pretty hard. When you talk about what's happened on the servicer side, for example, those servicing loans for Fannie or Freddie, and there's a big conversation around that and the impacts there with all the forbearance activity going on. There's kind of that perfect, terrible storm lining up where we could see just an enormous volume of not great real estate market activity right after the first of the year, unless Congress acts. And they can extend the moratoria. They could pump funding in to support the different lending institutions. They could stand up new credit facilities to help support ongoing activities. Add into that 12-1, we just saw a 50 basis point adverse market fee from the GSEs come into play that had been postponed from September. So now we've added costs into the refinance transactions where people might be going to that last point where they can take cash out of the home to try and stay in it. Just a whole host of things that are really pushing us toward disaster. On top of all that, let's be candid. The Trump administration has no intention of doing the incoming Biden administration any favors. And one thing that they could choose to do is reprivatize an undercapitalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on their way out the door. And if they did that on top of everything else, this would make what looked like what happened in 2007, 2008, like child's play. We're talking magnitudes worse in terms of potential impacts that are sitting out there on these balance sheets and on these books. And I don't think people are talking enough about the disaster that we could be staring down if enough things don't go right. And you think, oh, of course, they'll fund all this stuff. Well, you've got a president who's holding up the Defense Authorization Act because he doesn't like Section 230 of the Communications Act. Figure that one out. So this is the environment we're in, and nothing's guaranteed. And there's a lot of stuff that could go wrong in a hurry if Congress and, more importantly, the executive branch don't act.
But how in the world could you do an IPO on Fannie and Freddie between today and January?
in a normal circumstance with normal operating procedures and normal rules of the road, I would agree with you, but there has been nothing normal. A lot of what doesn't get talked about, and it's very inside Beltway, we're seeing enormous purges. There's a move right now with Schedule F in the civil service to reclassify whole hosts of career government employees into the appointed service so that they can be fired before Biden takes office. There's just a lot of things going on you would not typically anticipate in a change of administration. There's a clear desire being shown by the outgoing administration to really salt the earth and leave Joe Biden and the Democrats in the worst possible position post-transition. A lot of it's stuff you're not hearing about and that you're not seeing necessarily, in the front pages or on CNN or wherever you get your news. And these are the kinds of things that are going to make it that much harder day one for the work to be done to start overcoming the damage that's being wrought within the gears of government right now. It's the type of bureaucratic stuff that doesn't necessarily get people excited, but people need to be paying attention to because it has the potential to be catastrophic. If the government goes home December 11th, and they even go home for just a week, there's a process it takes to get the government back up and running if they get funded. That's a significant time lag when you're trying to stave off all these various crises that we could be staring down on January 1st. So a lot of things going on. I know it's hard to necessarily pay attention to everything. Just understand that if 2 or 3 things go in a direction we don't want them to go, January 1st could be a real ugly day in terms of where things trend in this country. Economically at least, not to speak of personally.
No, I hear you. We've all been ignoring that. I mean, you look at the stock market, just keeps hitting all-time highs, and of course, all the stats on the housing market are all good. So everybody seems to be lulled into this false sense of security, and you and I know that that cliff is starting to get closer and closer.
And you think about parallels to 07, 08. I, like everybody else, I refinanced recently, and I got my appraisal, and I knew I had a comp around the corner that sold for way more than it should have, and it got downward adjusted by the appraiser rightly. But that's not the only example I know of where a house went for way more than it should have sold for. Just in my own neighborhood, it's happening in my backyard. We're seeing it with the flight from the cities to the suburbs, people wanting yards and space. They want more room in the midst of the pandemic. They're taking on, these loans. If you're getting money at, 3% down and at 3%, people think it's free money. They're not thinking about, well, what happens if the market does a complete 180 and suddenly values drop out? Again, the parallels are there from 07, 08. I think the scarier part is I think the magnitude could be worse. And we talk about how, oh, no, we're better off this time. We have these different safeguards in place.
Oh.
Unfortunately, when you let the market go just into complete irrational exuberance for so long, and it has, there's no reason why we should be seeing the activity we're seeing other than people are making decisions based on the short-term nature of the pandemic and getting themselves in homes that are not worth what they're paying, quite candidly. The disaster's there in the offing if the policy work, if the legislative work isn't done to head off the storm. Not that makes any better what these people have walked themselves into, but over time they can pay down the loans and get themselves out of what could be an underwater position. But if they don't have that time, if everything goes sideways in a hurry, we could be looking at a real mess on our hands. And I don't think it gets enough attention in the mainstream press for sure. But even in our community where we know better and we're a lot closer to these issues, I feel like we're just not paying enough attention to it. Not to be, an alarmist about it, but the potential for disaster there.
I'm in the same boat you are. Let's come back to that topic in just a minute. I'm going to go back to Jim and let him offer up another commercial message.
Appraisers, if you've grown frustrated with endlessly pursuing new appraisal work and not reaping any of the benefits, Metrowest is here to help. They understand and work to alleviate the pain points commonly felt by appraisers to enable personal and financial growth for their staff. After all, they've been owned and operated by appraisers since the company opened in 1987. Metrowest Appraisal is an equal opportunity employer, and they're always looking for certified residential real estate appraisers to join their team. Visit metrowestappr.com/careers or email careers@metrowestappr.com.
Thank you, Jim. So, John, given that we're both in agreement that we have a potential real estate catastrophe coming our way, What changes do you think reforms need to happen in the appraisal profession in order to, I know we can't stop booms and busts, but I sure would like to have a system in place where we can moderate them and tamp them down and do a better job of reading the tea leaves, if you will, maybe a little more scientific approach into the way we manage collateral risk.
Well, I think it's not necessarily looking at Congress to fix it or agencies to fix it. A lot of it just comes down to, candidly, the questions that appraisers are asked. I'm a big believer that appraisers are not asked as much as they know. I think appraisers, when it comes to property economics and microeconomics, are some of the smartest people going, because they live in these communities. They understand what's going on the ground, not just with housing, but they understand where the businesses are coming and going, where jobs are ebbing and flowing to and from. And when you're within the strictures, even though we know that there's new forms coming eventually, allegedly, and new data sets and whatever, that doesn't give them any more breath to give you more information than what you're asking. If the question is inherently proscriptive, a point in time value as of a date certain on a specific property using comparables within a certain tolerance band, and that's all we want to know about it, and we're not asking more of the appraiser in terms of what they know, then there's nothing more that the profession can do to help stave off these kinds of issues as they come up. And it's funny, simultaneously, the lending community treats the appraisal as the go, no go on the underwriting decision, when really it's an input. So to me, I'd want a better input. I'd be asking those questions of, hey, what's the general economic climate in this area? Are jobs coming or going? Is this somewhere where we can expect steady growth? Do we see a decline on the horizon based on the industries? A lot of it comes down to asking the right question. I don't think from a mortgage finance, a housing finance perspective, the right questions get asked. And unfortunately, I don't think the machinery is in place to turn the ship quickly enough to get better inputs into the system overall. I think we've walked into a situation where velocity became king in a very short time frame, and it's chasing that extra 1 or 2 basis points in the deal, but at what cost of understanding what's really in front of you. And when you're in an environment where you turn everything around and you sell it into a securitized product, the investment in making sure you've done quality work and that you really understand what you're lending on, that impetus goes away. If you really wanted to make one significant change, frankly, make lenders carry more risk on their books. Don't let them just turn around and hand it off to Fannie or Freddie or white label securitizers. When you have to hold the paper, it changes the calculation, whether that's the regulatory requirements on things like QRMs or even just your own internal lending practices. When you hold the loan, suddenly if I go from 5% to 20%, yeah, maybe it reduces my total lending capacity, but I'm also going to make a lot better decisions down the line because I know the risk to my lending institution goes up exponentially. To say nothing of the non-bank lenders out there, and they're just, rolling the process, and whether or not that's healthy as well, because that's all they're doing is feeding in the secondary market. There's just a lot of different things we could look at. I think the biggest thing comes back to asking appraisers more because they know more, and then being willing to take that information and make a real underwriting decision. Don't just leave it to your systems in place. I think we got so far away from humans doing the work of underwriting that now it's just kind of, well, the computer told me. Well, the computer's not the decision maker, you are. Use your intuition, use your professional judgment, make a real decision. We've just gotten far away from that because everybody wants to get everything done, close in 21 days, which is nuts to me that that's where we're at in the world. Maybe I'm the youngest Luddite out there, but I'd rather see quality work that takes time as opposed to churn and burn in 3 weeks and then everybody walks away and then 18 months later we're shocked to find out the house is in foreclosure. That's not where anybody wants to be, but unfortunately our structures and our systems today are set up for that exact kind of outcome.
I get accused of being a Luddite all the time on one hand, and then on the other hand, I get accused of being way too pro technology. So I think they're actually both correct. I just believe that the future of our profession lies in the merger of man and machine. I think there are exciting opportunities in AI and with AVMs. And by the way, I someday, if I accomplish anything, they are not AVMs. They are SPMs. They are sale price models. They have nothing to do with value. And that is the whole fallacy in an AVM. And also a fallacy in the current appraisal process with one approach to value, the sale price approach to value. You're just emulating the greater fool theory of what some knucklehead last week overpaid for that house, and you're calling that market value, and it is not. So you got some fundamental problems here.
And what you brought up dovetails nicely to where we started the conversation, because technology is just a tool made by man.
Right.
Go back to the dawn of time when we made, simple stone hammers, a stick and some, long grass and a rock. Technology is no different. It's just more advanced. Right. And technology reflects the preferences, the biases of the individuals who create it. Right. So when we talk about stuff like unconscious bias, that stuff exists in the models people rely on, folks. I hate to tell you, it exists in the artificial intelligence. When you don't have a diverse set of developers building out the models and making sure that all of those biases are controlled for, all you're doing is baking those same biases into things that you call technology. And when you've removed the humanity from it, it becomes even harder to overcome. So I think, in the rush toward technologizing, if that's even a word, everything in the housing finance process, we wind up with baked in assumptions that may be wrong, that we're constantly fighting. And we also wind up with over-reliance on the tool. The tool isn't the one that makes the decision. The person using the tool makes the decision. And far too often now, we put the decision in the hands of the tools that we use. And there's got to be kind of a rebalancing that takes place. And look, you could go way macro on this and say that in society today, because of social media and our phones in our faces, we've removed humanity from so much of our interaction. And I'm a big humanities guy. I'm very much, this period's killing me. We talked about before we started. I'm not in the room. That's where I thrive. That's where I like to be, because I think it's the human to human interactions that are most meaningful. And where we are today, culturally, societally, we've gotten so far away from that. Just we're reflecting it in housing finance in a way that may not necessarily be healthy in terms of the outcomes that it steers us toward, generally, but then obviously the downline disparate impacts on minority communities as well. So kind of tying it all together there with a bow. I'm probably a bit too, squishy, ephemeral with some of this stuff for some folks, and that's fine. But I come from a liberal arts communications background, so I'm a little more right brain, I think, than a lot of people in the space, and that's okay.
Let's face it, appraising is part art, part science, and it never will be any different. And there's definitely the crowd that thinks it should be pure science, hit an easy button, let an algorithm do it. And then the weird thing is, which I can't even figure out what box to put it in, is the movement for hybrid appraisers to have untrained, unlicensed individuals doing what I think is the most important part of the appraisal process. And they're trying to convince us that this is modern. It's like, that's kind of just the dumbest idea. I just put it out there. It's just dumb.
Yeah, it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. And 10 years from now, someone else will come out with the same, what we used to call the hybrid was really a desktop. And then in 10 years, we'll rebrand it again. Right. New thing I came up with. It's like, no, you dummy. We've already had that. And it didn't work. And here's why. Yeah. And, it's up to folks like us to remind people who come behind with what they think is latest and greatest that it's not really that latest, and it certainly isn't the greatest. And there's a reason that over time, the baseline principles of appraisal practice have always worked, because they're tested and they rely on human judgment, human decision making. Right. You will never get that out of a truly robust process, because the moment that you do, you lose the ability to overcome for the biases that we bake into our models and our tools and our techniques. And I think that's just the most important thing, is keeping that humanity in there. The more we try to get away from it, the more dangerous it becomes. That we,
I couldn't agree.
Don't know what we're doing anymore.
Couldn't agree with you more. Well, nice way to wrap it up for us, as you said, right in a bow. So with that, I think we're going to close unless you have any final parting words of wisdom.
Not so much words of wisdom, but shameless plug time, www.appraisers.org. We've got pathways for everybody in the real property space, whether you want a professional designation through our candidate track, or we have our new ally membership for those who just want to come in, support the organization, be able to get member pricing on our education and events, and access to our monthly e-newsletter. So again, www.appraisers.org or 1-800-ASA-VALU if you want to talk to a real live human being, because human beings matter too.
Wow, that was a great commercial. Jim,
Well,
you need to take a lesson from that
What
guy.
an unfair segue to Jim.
Yeah.
yeah, I know, really. Well, in uncertain times, you need a certain partner. You don't have to sacrifice top-notch coverage for an affordable premium. Intercorp has all the options and is sure to have just the right one to fit your specific needs. They provide the appraisal profession with competitive, best-in-class E&O coverage solutions nationwide. Having served the insurance needs of the industry for more than 25 years, Intercorp understands the risks that you face every day. Visit intercorpinc.net to get a competitive quote today. Thank you so much, John and Joan. This was an excellent Buzzcast. I'm so excited to do a second one follow-up in the coming months after the new administration comes in and we see how it affects. It's been a really interesting Buzzcast today, and I think people will be very excited to listen to it.